Well, it is my distinct honor, pleasure to be able to get to introduce Dr. Sarah-Lan Mathez-Stiefel. Sarah-Lan, I met a number of years ago in Peru while I was meeting with a number of our Hunger host partners. And as soon as I met her, and as soon as she brought me to probably the best seafood place I've been in Peru, Canto Ranito, in the Mercado de Barranco, we got to talking, and I was just so impressed with the vision and work of Arasha in connecting churches and connecting communities with reforestation projects around Peru and other kinds of conservation projects. So we've been looking for an opportunity to invite Sarah-Lan to join us here at Wheaton to be able to talk with this community. So a quick word here about Sarah-Lan is she is a Swiss ethnobiologist that has been living for the past 8 years in Peru, where she is the executive director until today, right? Last day as executive director will be the scientific director at Arasha Peru, a Christian nature conservation nonprofit organization, and one of our Hunger Program partners, that is part of the global family of Arasha International. Sarah-Lan was trained in ethnology and biology at the University of Neuchâtel and received a PhD degree in human geography from the University of Bern in December 2011. In March 2014, so tomorrow I believe, she will start a postdoctoral fellowship at the World Agroforestry Center, ECRAF. Her research will focus on the potential of agroforestry systems for climate change adaptation in the Peruvian Andes from the perspective of smallholders. Presently a senior research scientist at the Center for Development and Environment of the University of Bern, Switzerland, Sarah-Lan has over 10 years of experience working in international cooperation projects involving research institutions, NGOs, community-based organizations in Latin America, in Eastern and Southern Africa. Her professional interests focus on sustainable development and natural resource management, community-based conservation, traditional ecological knowledge, of which we'll hear about a bit today, and biocultural diversity. So it is my distinct honor to get to introduce Dr. Sarah-Lan Mathez-Stiefel.
Well, good afternoon. First of all, I would like to thank the organizers of the symposium to give me this opportunity to share some of my experiences and to invite me. And I'm especially happy for two good reasons. One, as Ryan already mentioned, is that I met him and then Rachel. We hosted Rachel as a Hunger intern in 2011. So it's a great pleasure to come here and visit here at the university and know other people from the program. And the second good reason is that the chairperson from the Board of Trustees of Arasha International, which is the umbrella organization we're working with, is a Wheaton College alumna. So I was really happy to have this opportunity to be here. Okay, so I will talk about two topics this afternoon. One is traditional ecological knowledge in the Andes, mostly Peru and Bolivia. And the second topic is a reflection based on concrete experiences of collaborative action for soil conservation in Peru. Just a brief introduction. I think that when we talk about soil improvement, soil conservation, and we recognize all the problems of natural resource degradation and soil degradation, mainly in developing countries, we often look at local people and smallholders as being responsible for most of these degradation processes. And this for a number of reasons. Increased demographic pressure, the fact that they rely directly on these resources for their subsistence, so they have to intensify their agriculture, the fact that often they are blamed of using unsustainable practices, or we had many examples already since yesterday of cutting the forest and not doing the fallow, etc., etc. I think that since this symposium, the title of this symposium is From the Bottom Up and wants to look at social movements, I really wanted in this presentation to focus on the other side of it, and really on the agency of local people and the important role that they play and that they could play even more if you would promote it in restoring soils and natural resources and in helping conserving these resources. So this is why I will discuss about one specific aspect, which is, I think, very important, which is traditional ecological knowledge. First of all, I will give you a brief definition of traditional ecological knowledge and of its characteristics, and then I will give you some more concrete examples about this type of knowledge in the Andean highlands and how this type of knowledge is linked to soil and biodiversity conservation. And then, as I said before, I will reflect more about collaborative action for soil conservation. How can we support this type of initiatives that build on local knowledge and traditional knowledge, and what are some recommendations for successful initiatives? And I will draw mostly on experiences from Russia, Peru, and the projects that we are implementing along the coast of Peru. So first, traditional ecological knowledge. So there are many different ways of naming it. Some people talk about local knowledge, other indigenous knowledge, indigenous environmental knowledge, indigenous ecological knowledge, local knowledge, rural people's knowledge. There are many different ways of calling it. I'm not going to enter into this debate now, but I would like to say that recently there has been a growing recognition in international discourses of the importance of this type of knowledge, both for human development and for conservation of nature and of biodiversity. And this has been recognized in some of the international reports, such as the Brundtland Report on Sustainable Development, the Rio Declaration in '92, the Convention on Biodiversity, etc. More recently, at the Rio Summit Plus 20 in 2012, in the declaration called The Future We Want, it is clearly said, and I wrote it here in the slide, we recognize that traditional knowledge, innovations and practices of indigenous peoples and local communities make an important contribution to the conservation and sustainable use of biodiversity, and their wider application can support social well-being and sustainable livelihoods. So as I mentioned, there is a growing recognition in international discourses of the importance of this knowledge. However, there is little yet being done to really integrate this knowledge into policy making and into project implementation. So first of all, what is traditional ecological knowledge? I'm using here the definition from Fikret Berkes. So traditional ecological knowledge is a cumulative body of knowledge, practice, and belief, evolving by adaptive processes and handed down through generations by cultural transmission, about the relationship of living beings, including humans, with one another and with their environment. So I think it's important to understand that because we call it traditional doesn't mean that it is static or unchanged. It is very dynamic, so it is a knowledge that has been transmitted from generations, but it is also adapting and changing with the time. This gives a huge potential of resilience to holders of this knowledge. These local communities and indigenous people have always had to adapt to changing conditions, and they have this capacity within their knowledge systems. Now, another aspect I wanted to focus on is that traditional knowledge, traditional ecological knowledge, is not only technical knowledge about plants or animals, uses. It also has different levels, different aspects or culture that are part of what we call traditional ecological knowledge system. And here are the levels of analysis that can be used. The smaller level is the local knowledge, direct knowledge about animals, plants. It can be also about animals used as indicators of climate variability. It could be plants used as medicine, and a lot of different technical knowledge. And then there is the level of land and resource management systems, which are more complex and include the interaction between different species and ecosystems. And then we have all the social institutions, norms, regulations that are linked to this management and this relationship between societies and their environment. And then the higher level is the worldview, how we understand the world, the role of human beings, the role of nature, etc. So there are all these different layers that are needed to understand the complexity of traditional ecological knowledge. This also means that this type of knowledge is valid within its own culture and context, and loses much of its richness if you just decontextualize it or just try to document it and just to apply it as it is in another context. So now traditional ecological knowledge in the Andes, so starting to say something about this higher level and the worldview and how this influences the management of local resources. First, the Andean region is a region that has historically always been highly populated. So there is a very, very long history of interaction between local societies and their environment. This environment has been managed and transformed by human action for centuries. It's another way of putting it. It's also important to understand that these are areas of very high diversity, both of ecosystems, because of all these different altitude belts. You have a lot of different diversity of both global layers, belts, and also microenvironments. But also it's an area of high, very harsh climatic and unpredictable climatic conditions, with hails, frosts, droughts, etc. So it's the combination of this diversity of ecosystem and the history of management by human societies have led to a society that has developed a very specialized knowledge about how to manage this ecosystem. I think it's first also important to understand that Andean cultures are very agrarian. Part of their culture is this management is really part of their own culture. They don't see nature as something outside, external, as an object. They see an interrelation between the social, the natural, and the spiritual spheres. These are all interrelated. Another important aspect is that the term they use to talk about growing food is crianza, which means actually nurturing or raising a child. It's the same term that we use to say raise a child and to say to grow food. So actually it's a relationship of also an emotional and social relationship with the seed and with the soil. The soil is the Pachamama, it's Mother Earth, which has to be treated with respect in a relationship of reciprocity and complementarity. You cannot just take something. If you want to take, you have to give in order to be able to receive. And this is true between these different spheres of life. This is also true within the society. There is a complementarity and a reciprocity between neighbors, between husband and wife, between communities. So these are some of the principles that just help you understand the type of relationship that is then the type of principles that are then translated into management practices. Now to look more specifically about our topic of soil management and conservation, I thought it was interesting to reflect about what are their food security strategies. As I explained to you, these are extremely hard conditions, and it's really, coming from the outside, it's very impressive to just imagine how could societies during centuries just live in these conditions. In some areas where sometimes they are higher, 1,400 feet high, and they're still able to survive, to grow the food they need, and to pursue their livelihoods. So some of the strategies they used, one of the most important is diversification. So it's the strategic use of these different ecosystems and agricultural belts at different moments of the year. And also, so it's a diversification in space and also in time. You know, there is a very complex system of crop rotation, and the Ant families have parcels of land at different altitudes within the community's territory. So they are able to perform this rotation every year at different levels, different altitudes, and of course different crops grow at different altitudes. So there is this spatial and time diversity, also the management of an extremely high number of species and varieties. The Andes are one of the cradle of agriculture, and some of the major products such as potato were domesticated in the Andes, where we now find over 4,000 varieties. So it's very impressive to look at all this diversity that is managed, this agrobiodiversity. Another strategy is the one of minimizing risk, and more in particular climatic risk. As I mentioned, it's an area where you have very harsh climatic conditions, a rainy and a dry season, but sometimes the rain don't come or come late. There are hails, frost, and a lot of different events, which are extreme events, which can just destroy all your production. So there is a very careful planning and prediction of these variables and planning of the sowing in function of it. And for that, they have developed a very sophisticated knowledge based on the observation of plants and animals, of the phenology of plants, in order to predict the climate events. And then there are other techniques that are used in order to minimize risk. As I already mentioned, the diversification, the fact that you are managing several hundred varieties of potatoes, for example, enables you to have some that are more or less resistant to droughts, to frost, etc., and that have different characteristics. Some of them are good to be dried and frozen and dried, and can be stored for over a year, and this is also a food security strategy. So there is a whole lot of different practices that are linked to minimize risks. And then the other one, which I already mentioned before, is the complementarity and reciprocity. And this can be observed at the level of the whole farming system, where there is a complementarity between raising animals and pasture and the crop production and the rotation of crops and fallows with pasture and crops and fallow with pasture. And of course, these systems vary according to the altitude and to the specific microenvironment. Then there is also this complementarity, this reciprocity between communities and within communities. Fairs are very important as meeting points in the Andes between people from different altitudinal belts, where they can exchange products, for instance. You also have very complex social mechanisms that allow for mutual help, for instance, and that allow to perform all the very difficult tasks of crop production in the Andes. You will see then a more specific example. So all these different strategies have led to a very, very specialized knowledge about how to manage the environment. Here are some pictures of the diversity, agrobiodiversity. You have diversity of mazes. Here are a lot of different tubers. Here you do not have potatoes. I mentioned the potatoes. In one of the family I visited, they managed 121 varieties of potato just in 1 year. So it is very impressive. And then you have here a lot of different tubers, such as in Spanish we say oca, mashua, oyuco, oyucus tuberosum, a lot of different tubers which are not so well known outside, but which are highly nutritive and diverse. You have also the grains. You know, recently the quinoa has become a bit more well known abroad, but you have a lot of different grains from the Chenobodium family, Kaniwa, Kiwicha, etc., which are highly nutritious, and each one of these have a high diversity of varieties. And here I wanted to give you an example about this whole complex knowledge that I took from Pierre Morlon. So he wrote a book, if you're interested in this topic, a very, very specialized book on the traditional farming systems in the Andes, Pierre Morlon. So what he explains is that here you have the year, you can see the year of the month of the year, and you can see the alternance between rainy and dry season. During the dry season is also when the risks of frost are high. This means that this is the time in April, May, where the crops must be mature and harvested, because if you wait longer, then they will freeze. So, but this time is variable from one year to the other. It is not always at that month. As I said, the climate is quite unpredictable. So what farmers do, they have to calculate the time of the duration of the growth cycle of the crop. They have to estimate when will the hails and the frost begin, and then this will give them the window of time when they have to do the sowing. They cannot do it before because there are still frost, and they cannot do it after. If not, then the harvest will be mature too late during the year. So this gives a very, very little. Here you see only 1 month and a half between mid-September till November in that case, in that year, where everything has to be sowed. And in the Andes, people are working on quite deep slopes. It's very labor intensive. You have to calculate around 1 month of work to prepare only 1 hectare of land with the work of one family. So how do you manage this? How can you, in just 1 month and a half, sow enough food for you to be able to then live the rest of the year? So this is where what I mentioned before about the social mechanism are so important, of mutual help, and also a very careful planning of what sowing techniques, what soil preparation techniques you will use. So here you had the same graph in the beginning, and here are 3 different soil preparation, field preparation techniques that are used. With these examples, farmers don't use plow pulled by animals, but they use tools that are manually handed. It's a traditional tool that is called chaquitaclia that comes from pre-Hispanic times. So the first technique here is when you just till the whole parcel. So this is the one that leads to the higher production, higher yields per hectare, but this is also the one that is most labor intensive. You need more time to do this. Then you have another one which is a tilling system with ridges and furrows, where you actually only till 1/3 of the surface. And this also leads to quite fair amounts of yield. And then the third one is maybe a bit closer to the example that Craig gave us in Planting God's Way, is the one where you almost do not till. You just make a little hole and you just plant the seed at that place. So this is the example of the second line, the second technique, this ridge and furrow system. So here you can see that actually the effort you make is only 1/3 compared to tilling the whole parcel. And then the following year, there would be an alternance. So the furrow will be where the ridges are now, and vice versa. And actually, there is no one or the other technique which is the best. According to the slope, according to the exposure, according to the moisture in the soil and the altitude, people will decide which technique they have to apply to each parcel. And also, as I mentioned, according to the available labor. So it's a very complex decisions that have to be made each year in order to make sure that you will be able to make it through the year. So here you have some pictures with Dante, one of my students, anthropology students, how it looks on the ground. This is the second techniques. So here it's interesting because all the grass just remains where you plow you sow the seeds. So these were just some examples to show how complex this knowledge can be, and how useful they could be, and how much we could learn as external actors from this knowledge. And so what are some recommendations now for concrete actions that could support, that could build on traditional ecological knowledge? First of all, I think it's important to revitalize and to value this knowledge, because there is always, even though it is still transmitted from generation to generation, there is always the risk of loss among the young generation, the migration to urban centers, etc. And sometimes also the external development project really have played a negative role in rejecting this type of local knowledge. But second, I think that we should not idealize local knowledge as being the solution, because context has changed a lot. Even in the end, is now with the increasing population, for instance, people are not able to maintain the same fallow periods. So there is an increased pressure on the resources. So even if they know how they should do it, sometimes some external factors lead them to take decisions which are not good for resources. So as I said, the external pressure is different. External factors have changed. So I think that what is also very important is to promote a dialogue, and try a dialogue between traditional ecological knowledge and science-based and technical knowledge. I think that together we can really find innovative solutions to the problem of soil and other natural resources degradation. The other aspect, which I think is very important based on my experience, is to really try to promote multi-stakeholder engagement in our projects and participatory processes. I think that even though it has been recognized for already some time, there are still too many projects which are just designed from the desk from outside, or when there is some kind of participatory process, it is really minimum, and it will just consist of a rapid appraisal, and then we go back to our office to design our nice project. We do the project, and then we will just share again the results with the community, and this is participatory. What I call participatory process is participation of all actors involved during the whole process, from the analysis of the context, the situation, to the design of the project, to its implementation, and then to the evaluation of its results and reorientation of the project if needed. Multi-stakeholder, why? Because these local societies are very complex. We cannot assume that all have the same interest. There are also a lot of power struggles at the local level. Different actors are now often present, some private companies, government authorities. Within the same community, there might be some differences between leaders, women, other marginalized groups, which often are not so much included in these processes, but which may have different knowledge first, but also different interests and views on what should and could be done. Then a third recommendation is the importance of adopting an integrated approach. We cannot only protect the environment without looking at people. We cannot, caring for creation implies caring for people, because people are part of creation. On the other hand, if we care for people in these developing countries, we must care also for their environment, because they often rely on this environment for their survival. So this means that we need to be ready to really open our minds and we should not set the goals of our project and initiatives too narrowly, and we really have to be sensitive to the needs, both of the ecological needs but also social needs at the local level. And then the fourth aspect I wanted to stress is the importance of developing values. There are many good reasons, good or bad reasons, why we should conserve our resources. And I think that at the global level, there is a competition between these different value systems. Some would say that we should conserve resources for utilitarian purposes, just because we need them to survive. Okay, that's a way of looking at it. Some others will say that we need to conserve resources of nature because it's a kind of deity. It's also another value system. Or we think that here, as a Christian organization, I think that Christian faith has a lot to bring to all this discourse on environment at the global level, because it really gives the basic values why it is our responsibility to care for our environment, because it was made by God, who loves it and gave us this mandate of caring for it. And interestingly, different people and groups are often looking for these reasons and for orientation in what are the real reasons, what are the values that drive our decisions. And this can be done a lot through raising awareness, environmental education, and different ways. So now I will give some examples from Rocha, Peru, some concrete examples on how we try to implement these collaborative initiatives. So we are a Christian non-profit organization. We're committed to the environment and a member of the global family of Rocha International. Inspired by God's love, we work with local partners to carry out activities in conservation, environmental education, and applied research. Our vision is that we aspire to restore harmony between people and nature and ensure the well-being of all creation by enabling a responsible relationship with the environment. Many of you may already be familiar with the Rocha. Yesterday I had the pleasure to meet with some of the students of the Wheaton Rocha chapter, but some maybe not, so I will just briefly explain to you that we are part of a network of organizations that exist in 19 countries around the world, both in northern countries, in southern countries, in urban settings, rural settings, in a lot of different contexts. In all these countries where we share a same vision and we share 5 core commitments. And these are the ones here on the slide. So first, Christian. Christian, why? Because underlying all that we do is our faith in the biblical God who made the world, who made creation, and gave us as a mandate to care for it. Second, conservation. So we do implement practical conservation projects, conservation and natural ecosystem restoration projects together with local communities. So community, for us, it's very important to nurture relationship with our community, within our community at the global level as a Rocha, but also locally with the communities where we implement the projects. Cultural diversity, so we value cultural diversity also here, both globally, and we think that it's really a blessing that God gave us, that we should nurture and value, but also locally, for instance, in the case of Peru, which is a very diverse country. And then cooperation, so we try to make alliances and partnerships with different actors, both secular and Christian, that share our mission and have joint collaborations. In Peru, so you have the capital Lima, where we have our main office. So Peru is located in South America, on the west coast. You have here the Pacific coast. The Andes, which I mentioned to you earlier, are a bit more inland, and we're working mostly on the coastal area, which is extremely dry, semi-arid. In Lima, we have our main office. In Ica, where you see this black spot, we had a 4-year dry forest reforestation project that is now finished. And now we have started a new project close to Trujillo and another one in Talara in northern Peru. And there we focus on coastal ecosystems. So in Lima, we're working in the Lomas ecosystem. I won't give you more detail here, but I have on the table outside the room, there is a description of that project. We have now several dry forest restoration projects along the coast. The type of activities that we're doing, we already saw some of them in the video, is reforestation with native trees, environmental education, and there we work a lot with environmental clubs and local, and also with adult members of the community and churches. Then community engagement, so people are really part of the project and active volunteers in all the major steps, such as the planting and watering, etc. Then we do some applied research, biodiversity monitoring, outreach, organizing local fairs, and having a presence in local medias, etc. Stakeholder involvement. So we work with local communities, also with the private sector. And here we have a very interesting example in Talara, in the north of Peru, where we are starting a project with an energy company which has a wind farm, and that agreed to finance activities to restore the forest and to do a lot of environmental education and capacity development with local people on the sustainable use and management of the forest. We work also a lot with churches and with local and foreign volunteers. Our approach, I think one of the main characteristics is that all our projects are designed in a very participatory manner. So we include workshops to discuss with people about how was the area in the past, how they wish it would be in the future, and to decide jointly on what should be the activities implemented. We do try to take into account not only our interests as conservationists, but also social needs and interests of the different actors, local actors. And we put a strong focus on building local capacities. So we have a very, very small team of hired staff from Russia, Peru. We really try to train people locally to do both the seedling production, the reforestation, the environmental education, all our activities actually, also the research. And here, why is that important, the dry forest? As I mentioned, the coast of Peru is arid. There's almost no rain, only moist. So these trees, which are adapted to this ecosystem, have a capacity of water capture both through their leaves, they're able to capture water from the air, and also through their roots. So they are very important in capturing water for the whole ecosystem, and this then brings lives and allows and creates the habitats for other species of plants and animals, including endangered birds. Here you have a picture of the Phytotoma raimondi. For ornithologists, they would know it's a very important bird. And the tree has also a very important role traditionally in traditional farming systems of the Peruvian coast. So they traditionally were integrated into the farming system. Here you can see a picture of an old growth tree that is over 150 years old, and how they use it for shades for both humans and animals. As I said, we are in an almost desertic area. Also, the pods are very nutritive and used to feed the cattle, but also to make a series of products and processed into types of honeys and other types of products which have a commercial value and can be sold by local people. And of course, some other more natural ecosystem services, such as carbon sequestration. These trees are extremely good in sequestrating carbon. So here are some pictures of the activities. As you said, you see the planting is done in very hard conditions, extremely hot, slopes, not much water. And we really do rely on local people's commitment to both work with us and then to care for these plants and to water them. So the plants have to be watered for at least 2 to 3 years until they are independent. Then the environment education, and here is where we put an important focus on working with children, also with adults, but especially with children. We usually have children's clubs where we give part of the land is under the responsibility of the children. And this is formally recognized by local associations or authorities. And at that place, this is where the children have to plant and to nurture this land. They have to care for what they are planting so they can really learn that they have an important role and that they can bring a change. And they have a responsibility towards creation and towards also their peers and their community. And this is the place where not only are they caring for this area, but we also have creation care classes based on biblical teaching and other activities. We also have recreational activities. So it's an important space that is under the responsibility of children and that links them to the natural environment. Then community engagement. Here you see pictures where some churches are involved, others where we organize or we are part of local fairs. I'm trying to raise awareness about the importance of the dry forest or the importance of the multiple use that can be made out of it. And then research. And this is mainly done with local university students from neighboring cities. They often have to, in this case, these are biology students, and they have to do some type of internship within their training, but they don't have really the opportunity to do it. Their only opportunity is to work unpaid for private companies in industrial agriculture, which is usually not why they chose to study biology. So they are extremely motivated. They are local. They are happy to learn about research techniques. We do research both in terms of the seedling production, the soils, but also inventories of flora and fauna to do some monitoring and to see what is the impact of the project. These young people often are also very active as volunteers in the other components of the project. So in each project area, we have a very strong local team of volunteers. And I should also say that we have always also hosted some external interns or volunteers, and this has always been also a blessing. So if you ever want to come to Peru and to have a very practical experience on the ground, you're welcome. Just some last words about our work. As I mentioned, as the last recommendation, but it's not the least, the importance of creating values. And we see a role as a Christian environmental or as a Christian conservation organization, we see our role at different levels. On one hand, we think we have to do a really practical action. It's not only about theology and teaching, it's really about planting physically and caring physically for our environment. But on the other hand, we are sure that by doing so, we can also sow something else in people's hearts. And this is, we can be witness of what it is to live as Christians and to live under God's and biblical principles. So these are the different levels that we work at, and we hope that we can sow seeds of hope also for these people and these children. Thank you very much.
Hi there. Thanks for talking to us. I have lots of questions, but I'll try and keep it short. I was wondering, in the Andes, I guess what sort of percentage of people are involved in subsistence farming exclusively, and how does and are they then simply part of the informal economy, and how does the larger market affect them, like the new popularity of quinoa and how that's become a standout in market trade and things of that sort?
So I would say that in the rural areas of the Andes, because you also have some large cities in the Andes, La Paz, the capital of Bolivia, or Cusco, these are big cities which are actually located in the Andes and which have urban characteristics. But in the rural areas, most of the people rely on agriculture for the subsistence, but not only. There has been a very important process of migration for paid labor, usually temporary, and in some area even permanent, both to the urban centers, so these can be neighboring cities in the Andes, but also even to further up to Lima or other cities. And then also migration to the lowlands, where there are more options for paid agricultural work, and to the coast. So some of the communities we're working with Russia along the coast are actually made of people that migrated some time ago from the highlands, because the conditions, because as I mentioned, the increase in population have made pressure on the resources high, and the conditions extremely hard. So I would say that even if it's not visible at the first glance, I'm sure that almost none of the family live only exclusively from agriculture. Because even elder people or people that do not migrate, actually they do receive some remittances from family members that are doing paid work. So it would be difficult to come with exact figures, I would say. Still, for these people, agriculture is still the ones that remained in the rural areas. Agriculture is still their main livelihood. How they are affected? Well, there are many ways in which global markets can affect local communities. One is with the commercialization and the selection of one or two varieties of potatoes, for example. This has a very negative impact in the sense that maybe economic decisions or programs would encourage that, the commercialization of one product, saying that it will bring an economy to these people. But actually what happens is that all the other varieties cannot be sold anymore. And these varieties, this diversity is needed in order to be able to survive, given the climate unpredictability, as I explained to you before. So actually it's very dangerous for somebody living there to just reduce, or it's even not feasible to reduce your production to one or two varieties. It would be really suicidal, because just to have one frost, one plague, and everything is gone. So this is a way where it can have a negative effect. So now there are some counter trends. For instance, now there is a boom of Peruvian gastronomy and cuisine, and linked to that there is also a revalorization of the wealth of the different varieties of products, because they are beautiful. You have some purple potatoes because they are good. They have different tastes. They can be used in different ways. So there is. I can see that increasingly during the last years, you can see even in supermarkets in the cities an increasing variety that is sold. But still, we are far from the 100 varieties I was describing you. Mm-hmm. Then I wanted to give you another example of the impact. Oh, you were talking about quinoa. I'm not sure if this is good or not. It's difficult to say. We need to do some more detailed studies. Some would stress that this is a very positive example, because mostly the ones that commercialize quinoa under fair trade program or working with cooperatives or associations of producers say it's a way of directly increasing their revenues. But there are also some studies that show that there is an increasing pressure over resources in the highlands, namely in Bolivia, in the Altiplano, with intensive quinoa production, which is now actually decreasing the fertility of soils. It doesn't mean that it's not because quinoa is bad, as I showed you, the farming system to be sustainable has to allow for a rotation of different crops and also from fallow periods. So also there, it all depends on how it is done to say if it's good or not.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
My question is about the genetic diversity of tuber crops found within the Andes region. And if you have any particular species that you feel have a large potential for hunger relief in other parts of the world. And my other question is if there's any germplasm collection or preservation projects that are preserving all of these rare species and cultivars of all these unique crops, since they're kind of at risk of being lost in the home preservation, as you mentioned.
So I think that yes, there is a lot of potential and that is increasingly recognized. Quinoa is the best example, but as I said, it's just one among many of the other varieties and species that actually have extremely high nutritional value, and this is not only true for agricultural crops, but also for animals. For instance, there in the Andes, the traditional animals that are raised are llama and alpacas. Sheep and goats and cows only came with the colony. And these traditional species actually have, for instance, very low levels of cholesterol, and people actually consume them. So of course it would need maybe a change of mentality. I would have to think what it would mean if people would start eating alpaca or llama meat. But actually it's extremely healthy. And these animals also have a very low impact on the natural resources. They're much more adapted to this highland context. So maybe it could be interesting for some of the other mountain areas in the world to start producing some of these and raising some of these animals or producing some of these varieties. And in terms of conservation, I do not personally work with that, but there are some centers, and namely there is the international center, Potato Center, is established in Lima. It's one of these international agricultural centers, and does a lot of work in terms of conservation of varieties and germplasm, etc. But then also, as you understood, the difficulty is that most of these varieties were produced and are maintained through their management. So how well can you conserve it ex situ is also another question, right?
Hello. 26,000 trees is really incredible. I was wondering, do you know approximately what the success percentage rate is of how many of those trees survive? And how do you deal with things like water availability for watering those trees? Or I imagine there's also frequently pressure as those trees start to grow from people who want to gather firewood. Like, how have you managed some of those things as an organization?
So this project just finished last year. So to give you a right answer, we should discuss about it in 5 or 10 years, to go back and really look how much have survived. During the process itself, there is some death rate of these seedlings and of this planting around. It's not so high if you have the right techniques, around 15 to 20%. But what we try to do is to replace these plants during the project. And now on the longer term, it will depend more on whether people actually stick to their commitment to not cut it, right? And this is what would need monitoring. And this comes, and also your other questions about water availability comes to the criteria we apply before choosing where to start a project. And the most important is the commitment of local actors and their real motivation to really restore and conserve this area. This means that there need to be clear land tenure, which is often not the case, unfortunately. It means that it has to be very clear this land where we're planting, who does it belong to, and this person or this community or this private company, will they sign an agreement and commit to care for these trees and preserve them. And then the other aspect is water. As it was rightly pointed, water is really a crucial resource in this arid area and extremely scarce in some places. So what we did is that we can only do it where there is enough water, and that people, local communities, will agree to water and to give this water for the project. The other case where we're working with a private company, the wind farm, this is easier because they have the funds. So they're just funding an irrigation system that we are building for that. But of course, it's one of the crucial factors, the water availability.
All right, thank you.
You're welcome.
I just first wanted to thank you for sharing with us. I can, I guess, to a large extent, personally relate to the concept you're talking about of traditional ecological knowledge. I've lived my whole life on a small-scale farm in northern New England, and I think just that familial system contains a lot of really complex and intricate everyday tasks and a lot of knowledge, and creates a lot of communal closeness that I haven't been able to find outside of that. And I've been struggling with, not just loving that lifestyle, but knowing and being able to articulate why I think it's worth preserving. And you've given me a lot of insights in that, so I really appreciate that personally. And I guess my question is also along those lines. One of the things you mentioned was kind of the potential for valuing traditional ecological knowledge and what that can do for a community. And so I guess, like, looking forward, what are the first steps to take to getting a community or an agricultural society to value traditional ecological knowledge? I don't know, I look at American agriculture and I feel like it's almost as if we have to reverse our tracks and go back and reverse the bad effects that industrialization has happened. And I mean, I've never been to Peru or anywhere else, but it seems like almost it would be better to preserve the simplicity and the purity in a lot of ways that their agricultural societies have. So how do you go about encouraging the valuing of traditional ecological knowledge?
Well, first, I think it's a long-term process, and it goes much beyond just valuing one specific knowledge. It's linked to valuing a whole culture and identity. Because as I showed you, this knowledge, specific knowledge, are embedded within management systems, social institutions, and worldviews. And in the Andes, for instance, it means, so that means that in order to revalorize or revitalize a specific technique, it's also important to have a different attitude towards Andean culture. Peru, as many other countries, are quite racist, and the dominant discourse was more one of very negative towards indigenous groups and cultures. So this is where we have to start changing our attitude and the way we try to promote local knowledge together with local culture, with local language, and this goes to different levels. There are some organizations that work at promoting intercultural education within local schools, with teaching in local language, Quechua, but also teaching local knowledge and values. So this is a way to do it. Another is to promote activities such as fairs, as competitions where we can really value and make visible this knowledge and this know-how. And another one can go through also markets. As we mentioned before about some of the negative impacts of markets, but I think it can also have positive impacts. I'll give you the example of textiles in the Andes, which traditionally is done with alpaca and llama wool and with natural dyes and very complex and beautiful designs. But most of this knowledge was being lost, and natural dyes were replaced just by artificial coloring, etc. But recently, thanks to all the tourism that gets to the city of Cusco, and there is an increasing demand for these natural dyed and traditional textiles because they are beautiful, even though it's much more labor intensive. So there is a market for it, and there are now some associations of women who are recovering these techniques and trying to, and because they see that they can also sell it then for a higher price. And this is also part of raising self-esteem about its own culture and its beauty and its potential. So there are many different ways. It all depends on the context, what can be done, what could be done.
Thank you.
Hey, thank you once again.